Okay, so I have all the players seated at the table now. This is the final table of a $450 event, so you'd expect players that are pretty inexperienced and make some, ill-advised plays. But these guys actually played really well. So to start it off, it was the first hand, and I have me here as the as the hero, just because that's how the software works. But this is actually Leo Goldberg in the first hand that we're gonna have played. This is the first hand dealt, and as a typical final table in this kind of spot, it folds around to the button, and Leo's going to open with Jack 9 off, which is, I mean, pretty standard. I think we would all open with that. That's not the play that we're going to be talking about in this hand. So, and actually folding in this spot on the button with Jack 9 off is a mistake, because the stacks aren't correct here. That everybody has under 20 big blinds. Not everybody, but almost everybody has under 20 big blinds, except for Leo and the big blind. So Leo opens. We don't actually get to see in the live stream what Dan Walk defends with, but these are my notes down here. So Dan is a creative, aggressive player, and we don't expect him to fold too wide, but it's still a good spot to pick up the blinds. We don't want to miss out on the opportunity. So we open a normal spot, a normal amount. Goldberger made a reasonable sized raise, 51 or 510,000. And now Dan defends, and we don't know what he has, but Dan checks the ace-6 2 diamonds flop. Now we can see bet here, but Dan is a creative, aggressive player, and the only other player at the table that has enough chips to make any plays. And this is a kind of spot where people just get crazy on these kinds of boards. So I think it might be a little bit more credible to check behind, which is exactly what Goldberger does. I'm not sure if that's exactly why he did it, but turns out he checks behind, and then he gets to see Dan check twice before he decides to commit any chips to the pot. So that's not the only reason why I like to do that here. Even if Dan decides to bet the turn because we checked it back, we could credibly rep an ace or any other big hand and raise the turn, which would put him in a tough spot. So I think that checking back here is this is a good board for a delayed c-bet. So he does check back. Now Dan checks, and Dan could conceivably have a king here, but we're not going to try to get him off of something like that. So Leo decides to go ahead and make a bet now, which I think is almost mandatory. You don't have to bet much. You're not trying to get him off of anything that has any value. But he just makes a little bet the same size as the bet he made before, which was 510,000, and it works out. And I think that actually works a lot more often than just c-betting the flop. I think if he c-bets the flop, he might end up having to face some kind of tough check raise and be in a weird spot. So I really like this play. Alright, so now we have this isn't the second hand dealt. There was a lap that went by with nothing interesting, but so the same two villains. We have Leo Goldberger and Dan Walk again. So this time the action folds to Goldberger. The graphic is not up here, but he has 2 jacks in this spot. So he opens to a standard amount. It folds to Dan Walk, who 3-bets to 2.1 million, which is an okay size. It's pretty normal, but against a guy like Goldberger, who we know to want to defend a lot and play a lot of hands in position, he may have wanted to try to go a little bit bigger to try to deter a call from a weak hand, but Goldberger has jacks, so it doesn't really matter. But Dan Walk's 3-betting here with 5-8 of clubs. So let's see how Goldberger, having 30-ish big blinds here, Should have probably just ripped it in. It would have been a natural play, natural sizing. Wouldn't have to make any difficult decisions going on. And he has Dan Walk covered, so he's not at risk of busting out and not moving up the pay ladder at all. Having the chip lead of the tournament. That would have been a natural, easy play. Probably should have shoved it in there with the 2 jacks. Anyway, he decides to call, which leads to some interesting post-flop decisions. So this is a great flop for Dan, who 3-bet with 5-8 of clubs. And the reason he's 3-betting with 5-8 of clubs here is he has enough to 3-bet fold. Goldberger's opening a little bit bigger than other people do, so you can take advantage of that a little bit by winning slightly bigger pots when you 3-bet and they fold. And he knows he's going to be opening really wide because he's the chip leader. Everybody else is kind of short. So the 3-bet, though the hand isn't very good, it's a good spot for it. So I don't really mind that. We actually saw it coming, both me and Mike Gagliano were the other commentators. Gags called it before Dan Walk even looked like he wanted a 3-bet, and he was right. So anyway, gets a great flop for the 5-8 of clubs and decides to go ahead and c-bet, which is obviously going to do. I don't know how he would react to a raise. Goldberg is in a tough spot now. You can't just give Dan Walk credit for having a queen. But I'm not really sure what he was looking for with the jacks. We thought he might be trapping, just ready to get it in on any flop, but that's clearly not the case by what happened afterwards. So Dan Walk bets pretty small now. He had 3-bet to 2.1 million. Now this gives him a chance to have 2 streets to play rather than just shove. I wouldn't have minded just shoving there. It's a little bigger than the pot, but it deters any action from Goldberger. But this way, he actually gets to play 2 streets, which is pretty impressive. So he bets 1.3 million. Goldberger then in this spot. Now you don't really beat anything except for a bluff having the jacks. So raising, everything worse is going to fold, and most likely, and everything better is definitely going to call. So raising doesn't make a ton of sense. I actually like calling here, but that's actually with the intention of getting your opponent to bluff again, which is what happened. So Goldberger calls. Just a few notes. Really, that's for me, but calls with the 2 jacks, and now Dan Walk. We don't know if he's gonna make another bluff here or not. So having the 5-8. You do have an open ender. Your opponent called. If you think your opponent is going to peel as light as ace high here, you can probably go ahead and continue and fire another bullet, because then they're probably going to fold. But I wouldn't expect most opponents to be folding 9s, 10s, jacks, obviously any queen. And Goldberg really could have a hand like kings and aces. I think he probably would have shoved it in pre-flop, but players do trap in that spot with these stack sizes for sure. So if you think he's capable of peeling with as light as ace high, then definitely go ahead and fire the second shell here. If you think he's got at least 8s or 9s, I would definitely give up if I was in Dan's spot here. But Dan fires all in, which was a big enough portion of the pot to get Goldberg to fold some hands with value. And we didn't expect, Matt Matros, and Mike Agnano didn't expect him to fold the jacks here, but and he didn't really know what he was going to do in this spot. He tanked for a long time and ended up folding the jacks. So that 3-bet, and then the sizing of the small flop bet really won Dan the pot. So that was a really well thought out play to give himself 2 streets to bet. If Goldberger just would have played a lot more straightforward, a little less scared, and just got it in. If you have 30 big blinds, you get 3-bet and you have jacks, just get it in. Don't make any tough decisions. Okay, so here's another of a similar mistake. Dan Walk opens for a min raise in the cutoff, and it folds to Travell Thomas, who has 15 big blinds. Dan Walk has 40 big blinds. And with 15 big blinds, we're almost always in an all-in or fold situation here when Dan Walk opens from that spot. It turns out we have ace queen off, and that's just an awesome hand to just rip it in with the 15 big blinds. You might get called by worse. You're going to get a lot of folds. It's a really good spot to be in. So Travell, I'm not sure if he's thinking about moving up the ladder or if he thinks maybe he's trapping. I'm not really sure why, but he decides to defend instead. So he just calls the big blind. Calls from the big blind, which leads to super tough decisions afterwards. Regardless of the flop, I mean, unless we flop huge, we have a short stack, a hand where we're not going to know where we're at, and against an aggressive thinking opponent. So it's going to be really tough to play out from here going forward if we're Travell, unless you just flop an ace or a queen, which doesn't happen most of the time. So, would have liked to see Travell just rip it in here. I'm going to go over what I would have done in this situation, in this hand, after the flop, but I wouldn't have let myself get in this situation. If we just put it in, we're in a great spot. So, he calls. He has ace queen with no heart, and the flop comes jack 9-4, all hearts. And with most flops, we're probably not going to fold the flop when we have ace queen. This one, however, I think we can just completely give up. Whatever plan we had did not work, and I think we're just going to give up. So we check. Dan bets near the minimum. He bets 40,000 or 400,000 when the blind is 300,000, giving Travell a great price. So because of the price, and he just doesn't want to let Dan Walk win with whatever he has, Travell decides to call. I think we should have just folded here. It's just too bad a flop for us. If Dan has a worse hand, so be it, because even if he does have a worse hand, there's not very many cards that we're going to be able to fight back with on the turn. So Travell decides the price is too good. He decides to call. And now we actually get one of the best cards we can get, an offsuit 10. So now we have an open-ender to go with our overcards. But, I mean, that could easily hit Dan also. So, we check again. Dan makes a little more normal size bet. It's still pretty small, giving us a good price. We could just draw it to it, but we have no idea if a heart comes. We have no idea if we're going to be good. Are we going to call it off if we make a straight or a pair when there's a heart? I don't know. We just don't want to be in this situation. That's why one of the reasons why we could have just ripped it in pre-flop, and we would have been in a great spot. Travell decides, based on physical tells, I think, from the live stream, he talks a lot. He's really good at physical reading, so that's why he likes to play these hands this way. But I think that the spot would have been so much better to just get it in pre-flop. We wouldn't have to worry about that. So he ends up making a great fold here, because Dan Walk had ace-8 of hearts. But he could have just got it in with ace-queen against ace-8 pre-flop, or maybe gotten a fold pre-flop and been in a much better spot. Alright, so the next hand we're going to do is the same two opponents. We have Dan Walk and Travell Thomas, and it's pretty similar. Dan Walk opens under the gun 1. Travell now has 10 big blinds, so he didn't know he was supposed to get it in or fold with 15 bigs with the ace queen. Now he has king queen in position, which is a hand that it does warrant flatting sometimes, but not when you only have 10 big blinds, because you're just playing fit or fold. There's nothing else you can do on the flop, and so Dan Walk opening this early on a 10-handed table, Travell could have found a fold here. Ripping it in is fine too, but there's some really short stacks, and Dan's not going to be too light under the gun 1. So this is a spot where Travell could have found a fold, could have got it in, which it's actually very close on which of the two should do. It kind of depends on how often player is opening, what are the rest of the stack size, what are the paid jumps are. This one, I think he probably should just folded, but he ends up calling, and we end up going to a flop, just the two of them again. This flop, Danwalk has two jacks, by the way, so he flopped a set of jacks. And because Travell is so short, usually on a flop like this, it's wet, meaning coordinated, with the queen and jack of clubs, and it does hit majority of people's ranges at this point, at least a little bit. So usually I would advocate betting, going ahead and c-betting like you normally would with whatever you had. But Travell's so short that it's going to be really easy to get him all in if he has any piece or hits any piece later. So I don't mind Dan's check. Oh, Dan checks. So now it's on Travell. With King Queen, I mean, he's only got one pot left. He's got to be so excited to get it in. I think he decides to trap, hoping that Dan catches a piece before he gets it in, which is ambitious at best. So Travell checks his King Queen, even though it's one of the best flops he can see. The safest card comes off on the turn. Now Dan bets really tiny. 500,000 here, and the blinds are 2 and 4, so it's a super small bet, just like he did with the nut flush. And maybe that tipped Travell off that he had a big hand, or maybe Travell's still trapping. I'm not really sure. I think Travell was really going out of his way to move up the pay scale. I think someone clued him in about ICM, or maybe he's done his own ICM reading, but I don't think he understands ICM correctly, because trying to move up a pay jump or two here in this spot, these two spots where he made these mistakes ended up really hurting his chances. So he ends up just calling here. I mean, he would have busted if he got it in and made the right decision, so I guess in reality it didn't hurt his chances. And the river actually comes really bad for Travell. The 10 of spades comes, and now Dan shoves all in, which is, the pot is 3.5 million and Travell only has 1.8, so it's a very natural bet. So that was a great job by Dan setting up with the sizing. Now Travell has to decide if he's calling all in or not, and I'm amazed. This is Travell's reading ability again, and that actually leads me to a point where a lot of times we kind of have given up on the idea of physical tells and reading people's strength, but that's often overlooked, and in the past it was way overrated. You know, everyone sees it on TV and thinks that that's all poker is. Then once you get good at poker, you start to think that those things don't matter too much, and people are constantly in their phones, not paying attention. If you pay attention constantly, you actually can pick up some feelings of strength here and there from opponents. I mean, Travell used this to his advantage a bunch of times in the tournament. He's very good at it, so that's a reminder that stuff actually does matter. So Travell somehow finds a hero fold here, but he could have just folded pre-flop or got it in pre-flop and ran out of flip, which would have been just fine. Now he's going to be stuck with 4.5, 5 big blinds going forward, which is just a nightmare of a spot to be in. Alright, so we have another situation just like the first one with the check back on the flop instead of the c-bet. It's slightly different because in this case we have Ben Beeman open limps now that we're down to 6-handed. I don't love this play. Like, I'm not an advocate. I don't say that I never open limp. I think there are times for it, but everyone has around 20 bigs. There's like maybe 20, 40, 50, something like that right now. Um, and so the blinds are just too important. This tournament is a little bit shorter than most when you get down to the final table, and so the blinds and antes are just too important to not give yourself a chance of just winning pre-flop. So I like a minimum raise here, probably better than an open limp. Anyway, he limps. It gets around to the blinds. Everybody folds around to the blinds. So it's just Ben versus Dan Walk, and the flop comes Jack Jack 6, and even though he is a limper, usually the blinds are going to check to you. You still have the initiative. That's not always the case. It's a little more natural for Dan to bet here as a limped pot than it would be if Ben had raised, but it's still a little bit awkward, and usually the blinds will check to the limper. So Dan does check. Dan has ace high here, which is actually a pretty good flop for ace high. Ben could c-bet. It's not exactly a c-bet because he's a limper, but he could bet the flop here. He has king high, but he decides to check it back because he doesn't think it's very credible. And if he bets later, it'll have a little bit more credibility, and he could also raise on a later street if Dan were to bet, just like we discussed in the first hand. So that is what ends up happening. Dan ends up, there's a super safe card. Dan bets his ace high on the turn, and Ben has a pretty tight image so far, and straightforward. So that helps with the credibility here. And the stack sizes are such that every bet matters so much. So Dan bets his ace high, mostly because he thinks it's good and just wants to end the hand. I don't think he thinks that Ben has a better ace high or a pair and that he's going to get him off of it. I think he just wants to end the hand. Now Ben, so he bets 450,000. Ben raises to 1.5 million, which is actually a perfect size because it represents his whole stack. So Dan, basically, if he wants to put any more chips in, he's pretty much going to have to put in 7 million, which is half of his stack. It's a lot. It's a lot to commit. So this is a really good spot for this bluff raise. And I do think it's credible because if he had limped with a jack, which, I mean, Broadway cards are limping cards, I think this is how he would have played it. And usually you don't want such a narrow range to be what you're representing. He's not representing only a jack. He could have a pair bigger than sevens. He could have been trapping with the limp with aces or kings or something. And he really could be raising and going with a 6 at this point. So I think there's lots of stuff that he's repping, and that it's a very good play. And it's the same as it's very similar to the first play where instead of c-betting, we just go ahead and check back and try to win the pot on a later street because it's more credible. And he does win the pot. Dan ends up folding. Okay, so now we have an interesting hand where I can talk a little bit about ICM. I'm not going to get into how to use it. That'll be my next video. I'm going to use the last 6 of these guys to talk a little bit more about that. But in this hand, it folds around to Dan Walk on the button, and Dan basically raises with any 2 cards here. There's 2 guys with just about 20 big blinds, so they're a little bit handcuffed. It's a little bit big of a stack to just rip in over Dan's open, especially when he's opening for a min raise. It's really tough to play from the small blind. There's not a lot of hands that you'd flat from the small blind, and I don't think he minds playing too much heads up against the big blind, who has Rob Saladin here, I haven't talked about much, has also been pretty tight so far. So I don't mind him opening any 2 on the button. He actually has 9-6 off here. Now Ben has ace deuce suited, and ace deuce suited in this spot with 20 big blinds. Since everybody else has 20 or more at this point in the tournament, and the pay jumps are not very big. The next 3 pay jumps are not very big, and they're very big in the end. I really like pushing the envelope here, and I think that ace-2 suited would have been a good spot for Ben Beeman to just shove all in. Just calling is difficult to play, but that's a pretty good hand to play. If you are going to just call from the small blind, that's a pretty good one. So anyway, he calls with the ace-2 suited. Rob Saladin then completes from the big blind. He's getting a great price, but he has 10-6 offsuit. And that hand, with that amount of room to work with, 20 big blinds, is just going to be too tough. You're just starting too far behind, and when you do catch a piece, it's going to be really tough to know what to do. So I don't like the call from Rob, but if you are going to call, you're probably going to have to get creative with some flops that, in order to make up for your lack of hand strength, you're going to have to win some pots that you're not supposed to win, and that is kind of what he tries to do. So let's go forward to the flop. So the flop comes ace, queen, jack, rainbow. Ben decides to lead this flop rather than checking to the razor with the ace-2 suited. He has ace-deuce of hearts. He doesn't have a backdoor flush draw. I don't think he loves the idea of letting another card come off, because these kinds of boards hit a lot of hands, so he probably thinks that these guys have somewhere in the range of gut shots, pair plus gut shots, middle pairs, these kinds of things, so he doesn't want to let cards roll off, so he decides to bet, which I like here. Now Rob, these are the kinds of hands that you might, if you're going to play 10-6 offsuit, I'm still not advocating doing anything, you should just fold in this situation, but if you are going to play hands that bad, you have to win more than your hand suggests, so you are going to have to be ready to battle, you have to have good reason to be doing that. So in this case, Rob decides to put in a raise here because he thinks that Ben leading into the razor might not be so strong. So, and he makes a pretty big raise. In my notes here, I wrote that it was a good use of leverage because it, if he believes Ben is weak, it pretty much forces him to make a decision for all of his chips, and Dan to make a decision for all of their chips, which is a big portion of his. So Dan gets out of the way with his 9-6 offsuit, which of course that happens. Now Ben is stuck with a tough decision here. He correctly does not believe Rob. I don't know how he sees through it because Rob had a pretty tight image, but he just doesn't believe that Rob is raising here with anything except maybe King 10 and Queen Jack, and he doesn't think he has those hands just by feel, just by body language, these kinds of live tells. So he just decides he doesn't believe him and sticks it in, which ends up working. And I don't know how I would have played it in Ben's spot. I probably would have folded, but he saw through Rob's bluff and just stuck it in. Rob has something to do but fold. Let me show you their hands in the graphic here. That was a big swing in the tournament too. So in the next video, I'll get into ICM, and I'm not going to break it down with equations and using money examples. You can find that online, or some of these other coaches will show you how to do that. I'm going to try to talk about it in layman's terms so we understand actually how to use it, not how to calculate it afterwards and see if we were right or wrong, but actually how to use it in real time. So thanks for watching this video, and look forward to the next one. I'm still going to use this same tournament and talk a little about ICM and endgame in tournaments. We haven't even mentioned a hand with Dan Buzgon, I don't think, and he ends up winning this tournament, so it'll be fun to talk a few hands out that involve him. He's kind of a buddy too. So yeah, thanks for watching the first video, and look forward to more soon. Hi, I'm Tyler Patterson from Check Shove Poker, and in this video I did a live stream with Mike Gagliano and Matt Matros at the Borgata Winter Poker Open, and we did commentary for the final table of the $450 re-entry million guaranteed tournament. So I'm going to use a bunch of hands from that to do commentary. I did commentary. I'm going to analyze them, break them down a little bit more for you here. And if you want to check out that live stream, you can go here. And watching it along with this little bit deeper breakdown might be a good way to understand what I'm talking about.